Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 428. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get through on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into it. Just remember to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey for the video version of the show, and it's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And here we go. First story up today. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Biden and McCarthy agree on $886 billion military budget. And this is a part of the negotiations on the budget, which, we really don't ever cover on this show unless it's just the defense budget that we get into. I feel like it takes a lot of effort to adequately cover the defense budget to really get into this behemoth. I mean, officially it's almost $1 trillion, but with the unofficial and, just counting the rest of the things that definitely fall under the umbrella of national security, the VA, Department of Homeland Security, intel agencies, well over $1 trillion. And so to really keep track of that, I feel like it takes most of my time. And if I get too much into other issues, then I can't spend enough time on the foreign policy stuff. So on the budget, I really just pretty much always focus on the military spending. So Dave writes, the debt ceiling agreement reached between the White House and House Republicans that was announced Sunday caps military spending at $886 billion for 2024, matching President Biden's requested budget. Republicans negotiated the debt ceiling deal, sought non-military cuts. The $886 billion cap for military spending represents about a 3.3% increase from 2023. And so this isn't surprising. I know that when I first got into politics, my view of things was that, that the Republicans didn't like spending and the Democrats did. It became pretty clear to me that both the Democrats and Republicans are corrupt and both support their own brands of welfare, and the Republicans love dumping money into the Pentagon. The White House and Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, a Republican from California, still need to get the debt ceiling agreement passed through Congress. Many hawkish Republicans will likely oppose the deal because, as they previously blasted Biden's massive $886 billion budget request as inadequate. So if the cap is 886, then some Republicans are going to have problems, including Mr. Lindsey Graham. Senator Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, slammed the debt limit deal in an appearance on Fox News Sunday. The Biden defense budget was a joke before, and if we adopt it as Republicans, we will be doing a big disservice to the party of Ronald Reagan. The biggest winner of Biden's defense budget is China because they will have a bigger Navy, Graham said. So this is absolutely absurd. If you look at and compare the U.S. and the Chinese defense budget, the U.S. military budget is almost 3 times that of China. And so if China is outperforming the U.S. militarily, then this is a problem with our military industrial complex. So, this isn't, I'm not bringing this up to now justify why the defense budget is so high or to say, that they don't waste a lot of things outside of this particular issue in price gouging from contractors. However, if Lindsey Graham is upset that we don't have enough ships and enough money to spend, then he should blame Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and others, and not this cap on the military budget. So here we have an article from Connor Freeman. Bipartisan group of senators calls for Department of Defense to investigate price gouging by major U.S. defense contractors. And Connor covered this on Friday's episode of the show in a previous article that he wrote. But I thought this was a nice follow-up from Connor because, it's not just him saying like, hey, we had this official who said this. Senators are taking notice now. And so maybe something is actually going to happen here. A bipartisan group of senators sent a letter to the Department of Defense chief calling for an investigation into major arms dealers accused of systematic price gouging on Wednesday, according to The Hill. The letter was signed by Senators Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Mike Braun, Ron Wyden, and Chuck Grassley. That's 1 independent, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. And, Wyden, Warren, Grassley, Sanders have all been in the Senate for a while. So they are people who hold power in Washington. These aren't marginal figures. Like, and no offense to these people, Thomas Massie or Matt Gaetz, they introduce a bill, they send a letter to the president. It doesn't really mean anything. These senators all do. Then the White House probably at least has to take notice and pay attention to it. The letter cites former Pentagon officials, auditors, and other insiders who spoke to CBS and accused military-industrial complex giants, such as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing, of ripping off the U.S. taxpayer. During a recent 60-minute report, Shay Assad, who worked as a Pentagon contract negotiator for 40 years, cites numerous examples of White House numerous examples while explaining to the outlet that these firms overcharged the Department of Defense for everything from radar to missiles to helicopters to planes to submarines and down to the nuts and bolts. The report said these astronomical price increases have worsened sharply amidst Washington's exponentially rising demand for weapon systems to bolster both Taiwan and Ukraine. So, there's a lot going on here, but this is a major issue. So, one thing, the letter, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin sat on Raytheon's board of directors before accepting his current post. The lawmakers charged that these companies are securing profits ranging from 40% to as high as 4,000%. So this is a major issue here, and I'm glad that we have Connor covering it for us at the Institute, and we will continue to keep an eye on this because this could be something that really starts to get the American people critical of the military-industrial complex if they find out that we're being massively ripped off by it. All right, next up, this story from Day to Camp. NATO troops injured in Kosovo after trying to disperse crowd of Serb protesters. NATO troops stationed in Kosovo under the Kosovo Force, KFOR, mission were wounded Monday while trying to disperse a group of ethnic Serb protesters. Tensions escalated on Friday after Kosovo police used tear gas to disband a group of Serbs who were trying to block ethnic Albanian mayor from entering his office building. The mayor won office in an election that was boycotted by the ethnic Serb majority in northern Kosovo. Serbs in 4 of Kosovo's northern municipalities have been protesting the results of the election that they did not participate in. Since Kosovo formally declared independence from Serbia in 2008, the ethnic Serb population of Kosovo hasn't recognized the government and considers themselves a part of Serbia. After Friday's incident, Secretary of State Antony Blinken slammed Kosovo in a rare U.S. rebuke of that country's treatment of the ethnic Serbs. The United States strongly condemns the action by the government of Kosovo to access municipality buildings in the north of Kosovo by force. Actions took against the advice of the United States and Kosovo's European partners. So this is interesting. I'll continue to monitor it. I still need to do a little bit more background reading before I can do deeper dives and get into more of what's going on here. But, these tensions have been boiling from some time and likely could get worse and heat up quickly as, these Kosovo and Serbia have sponsors in the West and in Moscow. And, with the situation in Ukraine, it doesn't seem like there would be any interest in either side, probably, certainly not on the Western side, of negotiating with Moscow to ease tensions in that region. All right, this is huge. This from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Drone swarm hits Moscow in largest attack on the city since the start of the war. Russian authorities said Tuesday that 8 Ukrainian drones targeted civil areas of Moscow, marking the largest attack on the capital city since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine last year. Moscow's mayor said the drones only caused insignificant damage to residential buildings and that 2 people were treated for minor injuries, but didn't need to be hospitalized. The Russian Defense Ministry said that 5 of the drones were shot down and that 3 were down using electronic warfare capabilities. Putin said the drones attacks were an attempt by Ukraine to intimidate Russian civilians. The attack came as Russia stepped up its bombardment of Ukraine, and Putin has suggested it was a response to Russian targeting Ukraine's military intelligence headquarters a few days earlier. Ukraine's covert attacks have increased inside Russia in recent months. Kiev does not officially take credit for the operations, but Ukrainian officials have hinted at their involvement. All right, next up, we have Russia looking to arrest Senator Lindsey Graham. All right, here we go. Russia places Senator Graham on wanted list over dead Russian comment. Russia has issued an arrest warrant for Senator Lindsey Graham over his comments about Russians dying in Ukraine and calling U.S. money spent with again in the proxy war against Russia as the best money ever spent. Now, we talked about this on yesterday's show, so I'm not going to do a deep dive into Graham's comments and all of this because, look, Graham is never going to go to Russia and face justice or anything like that. Certainly, we should, want him to face justice in the U.S. for the war crimes that he has committed in our names, but, that's never going to happen. So I don't think that's particularly important. What I do want to emphasize is that Graham's comments were apparently misrepresented by the Ukrainians, and that his statement that Russians are dying and then it's the best money we've ever spent were not two consecutive comments and were not related to each other. And so this would be Kiev that put out this misleading video and would be responsible for it. I will also say that, Graham's comments are still provocative, and the senator didn't seem very interested in correcting them or very upset with Kiev over all this. So it's still very important. Next up here, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute yesterday. Democrats in Congress demand more aggressive Ukraine policy. Several members of the Democrat Party in Congress are urging the White House to provide Kiev with significantly more military support. One representative wants the Joe Biden administration to place non-combat observers on the ground in Ukraine. Representative Jason Crow, a Democrat from Colorado, called for long-term investment in modernizing Ukraine's military. He believes that upgraded weapons will turn the country into a porcupine that cannot be swallowed. One suggestion Crow made was sending non-combat observers to the battlefield to learn through direct observation and communications with Ukrainian forces. Crow did not specify where the personnel would come from, whether it be the CIA, Pentagon, or another agency. However, deploying any Americans on the battlefield risks them being killed by Russian soldiers. Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat from Rhode Island and chair of the House Armed Services Committee, along with Sheldon Whitehouse, another Democrat from Rhode Island, and Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut, are backing a plan that would send ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. The rockets have a range of nearly 200 miles. The White House has rejected several requests from Kiev to send the long-range munitions to Ukraine. The Department of Defense went as far as modifying the HIMARS launchers it donated to Kiev to prevent the system from being able to fire the ATACMS missiles. Recently, the Biden administration suggested it may be budging on the issue as Washington backed London sending long-range air-launched missiles to Kiev. Adam Smith, a Democrat from Washington and ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, called on the White House to authorize sending cluster bombs to Ukraine. Groups of Republican representatives have sent letters to Biden demanding he fulfill Kiev's request to send the controversial weapons. Both Russia and Ukraine are reported to have used cluster bombs in Ukraine, typically intended for use against personnel and light vehicles. Cluster bombs carry smaller explosive submunitions, which are released in flight and scattered across the target area. However, the bomblets often fail to detonate and remain on the ground as duds, causing countless civilian deaths in former war zones, sometimes decades into the future. On Wednesday, Representative Jerry Nadler, a Democrat from New York, was asked if he was concerned about the F-16 transfers to Ukraine and it could lead to an attack, that they could be used to attack Russia. The congressman replied, "No, I'm not concerned, and I wouldn't care if they did." General Mark Milley, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told Congress a few days before Nadler's remarks, but I can say that we have asked the Ukrainians not to use U.S.-supplied weapons equipment for direct attacks into Russia. The congressman asserted that Kiev would not use the F-16s in Russia, That may be, but they are not going to use major weapons. Things like the F-16 they need for air defenses over Ukraine so they could provide air cover for their counterattack and things like that. Nadler said they're not going to waste it in Russia, which, just shows how incompetent our congressmen are. There are some members of the Senate, there are some people in the ranks of government who have a somewhat deep understanding of the world and kind of understand how things work. And Nadler obviously doesn't. There's attacks going on in Ukraine, in Russia all the time by Ukrainian forces. We're talking about the drone attack today, assassination attempt against Putin a couple weeks ago, neo-Nazi faction of the Ukrainian military carried out a cross-border raid in Russia just last week. So obviously they are using American weapons to attack Russia, and Nadler just has no idea, and yet he's a influential congressman. This is just sad. Earlier this month, Kiev carried out an assassination attempt on Russian President Putin by targeting the Kremlin with drones, and then, as I mentioned, the neo-Nazi faction targeting Russian civilian homes in Belgorod. Representative Crow dismissed calls for more oversight regarding Washington's massive Ukraine aid. Since Russia launched its invasion, the U.S. has pledged Kiev almost $120 billion in mostly weapons and military equipment. When you're fighting for your own survival and survival of your children, Crow said, you tend not to tolerate malfeasance. However, John Sopko, the special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, warned earlier this year that oversight was crucial. Sopko, who reported on billions of dollars of American weapons that fell into the hands of the Taliban, lamented his advice was unlikely to be followed. He said in a report submitted to Congress, there is an understandable desire amid Congress, a crisis, to focus on getting money out the door and to worry about oversight later. But too often that creates more problems than it solves. Given the ongoing conflict and the unprecedented volume of weapons being transferred to Ukraine, the risk that some of the equipment ends up on the black market or in the wrong hands is likely unavoidable. And so, obviously this is directly contradicting what Crow said. Now, we also had this report in Politico that was out this week that basically does warn from people in Ukraine that essentially what's happening is that there's a whole new class of oligarchs being created in that country. And then one more story I don't have to display here, but it's from the Kiev Independent, and it's just further comments on the F-16 transfer. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said the Western plan to send F-16s to Ukraine was unacceptable and playing with fire. So likely looking at more escalations from the Kremlin in response to those weapons transfers. All right, next story here, going to talk about some China news, and I really do hate being right, but, we recently had Joe Biden say, tensions with China are going to start to break soon, and we're going to see a thaw, there's going to be more talks. Well, as I said, that the U.S. would need to take concrete steps to show China, to show Beijing that it was serious and real diplomacy, and that the White House wasn't willing to do that. And so the U.S. said Monday that China has declined an offer for a meeting between Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and his Chinese counterpart. The U.S. proposed for the two military leaders to meet on the sidelines of a summit in Singapore this week, but Beijing has called for the U.S. to lift sanctions on the Chinese defense minister in order for him to meet with Austin, and the U.S. says they're not going to do this. So I'm pretty sure back in 2018, I said it was a really bad idea to sanction this guy because it could create a situation where when he's a higher ranking official, he's sanctioned, and then you're not going to be able to have talks for it with him, and that's essentially what has happened here. And again, the U.S. is going to have to take steps to show Beijing that is interested in talks, not just by saying, we're interested in talks, or calling Beijing and saying that we want to schedule a talk. They're going to have to actually do things like lift sanctions on Chinese officials for these talks to happen. And it seems unlikely to me that the White House is willing to do this. Now, part of this is the political climate around sanctions in Washington, where anytime you remove sanctions on anything, then it's completely, acquiescing to Beijing or Tehran or Venezuela, or wherever in the world that we have sanctions. If you lift any sanctions, then you're giving in, and this is a terrible tragedy that we can't allow to happen. Oh, look, this is a isolationist foreign policy where we don't care what happens in the rest of the world, which is just completely ridiculous. But particularly on China, the Biden administration is very hawkish, and people just don't recognize it. Very much like the Donald Trump policy with Russia. All right, next up here, U.S., Japan, Philippines to hold first joint Coast Guard drills in the South China Sea. The U.S., Japan, and the Philippines will hold their first ever trilateral Coast Guard exercises in the South China Sea starting this week amid rising tensions with China and the region. The exercise will take place off the coast of the Philippines and will be held from June 1st to June 7th. About 400 military personnel will take part in the drills, and Australia will participate as an observer country. The Philippines Coast Guard said the purpose of the drills is to strengthen interoperability through communication exercise, maneuvering drills, photo exercise, maritime law enforcement training, search and rescue, and passing exercises. The drills will come as the U.S. and the Philippines have been taking steps to boost their military alliance, including Washington formalizing its commitment to intervene if Philippines vessels come under attack in the South China Sea. The Philippines, China, Taiwan, and several other Southeast Asian nations have overlapping claims to the South China Sea. Chinese and Philippines vessels occasionally have encounters near disputed reefs, and the U.S. always reminds China during those incidents of the U.S. Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951 that applies to attacks on Philippines boats. The U.S. formalized the commitment when the Philippines President Marcos Jr. visited Washington earlier in May. The two nations issued guidelines to update the Mutual Defense Treaty that explicitly state that an armed attack on vessels of either country in the South China Sea would invoke mutual defense commitments. And so Biden has continued to expand on the massive U.S. military buildup really started under Obama, directed towards China. And one of the steps that the Biden administration has taken and probably carried out a little bit more successfully than the Trump administration is to gather more nations in this region within military alliances and direct that towards China, which obviously is going to be seen as very provocative from Beijing's point of view. Next up here, I believe this is the last article I have today. Report: Taiwan receives Stinger missiles as part of free military aid package from the U.S. Taiwanese media has reported that Taiwan received the delivery of Raytheon-made Stinger anti-aircraft missiles from the U.S. as a part of a $500 million package of free military aid that Washington has been preparing for Taipei. According to the Taipei Times, the Stingers arrived in a Boeing 747 on Thursday night. So far, the U.S. and Taiwanese government have not confirmed the delivery, but both sides recently said a $500 million in weapons would soon be sent. The $500 million in free weapons is being pulled from a U.S. military stockpiles using the Presidential Drawdown Authority, or the PDA. The primary was that was the primary way the Biden administration has been arming Ukraine. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act includes $1 billion in PDA funds for Taiwan. So this is, just a massive military buildup. And as we talked about, kind of cycling back to the beginning of the show here, Stinger missiles are a part of the military weapons that are being sent are paid for by the U.S. taxpayers, but overpaid for because, we're just trying to send weapons everywhere. There's so much demand, and so little oversight. These companies can pay essentially nothing and get everything from the American taxpayer, all of our money, and produce faulty weapons at far inflated costs. All right, everybody, wrapping up the show for our day. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Back with more shows later in the week.